Hi, SmashingConf. Hope this is the session you're here for because this is the session that's starting. This afternoon, I'll be sharing some tips on debugging layouts and CSS with DevTools in Chromium-based browsers like Chrome and Edge. You might have noticed that this is not a live session, it's pre-recorded. I'm coming to you from the past to tell you about DevTools. I'm not in particularly bad standing with the live demo gods today, but I do have a lot to show, and I was wondering how I was going to get through it all and be able to answer your questions. So that's why present day me is in the chat right now. Say hi, present day me, to answer questions in real time, while past me does the demo. So amazing technology in the time of coronavirus. My name is Rachel Simone Weil. I'm a product manager on the Edge DevTools at Microsoft. So as you might guess, I'm going to be demoing with the Edge browser today, but the large majority of the features I'll be showing you are pretty much exactly the same in any Chromium-based browser's DevTools. In fact, a lot of these features like custom shortcuts and movable tabs, which I'll be showing in a minute, were built by the Edge DevTools team and contributed back into Chromium to really make the whole ecosystem better for developers. There are even a few features like CSS Grid and Flexbox tooling that some of us from Microsoft and Google built collaboratively, which is pretty cool. So, hey, shout out to my Chrome pals. I will be demoing in Edge Canary today, which is the daily build of the browser. So for some of the really new features, if you don't see them in your DevTools yet, either go download Edge Canary to try them out now, or just wait a little bit and they'll make their way into stable. So let's go ahead and get started. Tip number one is to make friends with DevTools settings and experiments. So just like any software tool that you use, you want to get your DevTools set up just the way you like them. So normally I like to have my DevTools undocked in a separate window, which I can change up here. I actually think today I'm going to keep them docked to the right just for convenience. If you notice this little gear icon at the top, this actually takes you to DevTools settings. And I want to call out a couple things. First of all, I am going to change into dark mode. That's not really a designer feature. I just like being in dark mode. But I do want to call out a couple things helpful for front-end design. The first is changing the color format from authored to RGB. And this is a personal preference, but I'll show you in a moment why I like to override the way that colors are authored. There's also this show rulers feature, the setting. I personally don't like to have rulers on all the time, but I know that some designers do. So that's just a personal preference. So while we're in the settings, I also want to show you the experiments tab, which will let us enable some experimental features. So I'm going to click over here to experiments. And again, the very newest and latest experimental features roll out in Canary first and eventually make their way into stable. And I'm just going to check off a couple of experimental features for the demos that I'm going to be showing today. So CSS Overview, dual screen support, grid, webhint, custom keyboard shortcuts. And when I close, DevTools will actually prompt me to reload. So that way, all of these new features are going to be enabled going forward. As you saw, there are a lot of experimental features in there. I definitely recommend reading up on them. We have some documentation on Microsoft Docs, or honestly, you can just try them out, play with them, see how you like them. If you can't figure out what they do, just turn them back off. That's usually what I do. All right, so tip number two is getting more details with the on-hover element inspection tool. Now, okay, we're going to start simple, so I'm really starting with the basics here. I'm sorry if this is a bit of a refresh for some of you, or, maybe this is old news to you. But when I worked as a freelance developer, I used the on-hover inspect tool all the time. But when I actually started working on the DevTools and talking to other developers, I found a lot of people don't use it or don't even know about it. So I wanted to make sure that I demonstrated that. So the on-hover inspect tool is up here at the top left corner. And when I turn that on, as I hover over elements on the page, I'm actually getting these tooltips that give me information about the color of, if there's typography, the color, the font, padding information, color contrast. I get accessibility information, as well as those highlights of blue, green, and orange, which represent, the content area, padding, and margin. If you forget what those color codes mean, they are represented in the box model here at the bottom of the styles pane. And I did want to bring this up because, of course, you can mouse over parts of the box model, but some folks don't realize that the box model is actually editable as well. And so I wanted to mention this because for me, tip number 3 is nudging numeric values with the arrow keys. For example, let's just take a look at this box model again. I do this all the time. You can see as I'm holding the arrow key up, it's actually nudging the padding value. In this case, it's the bottom padding of that schedule div is actually increasing that. And so this is a really, really handy way to kind of tweak your layouts, just like a pixel or two. And I also mention this because this is really handy for me when I'm editing colors. So this is why I set all my colors to RGB. Remember when we did that in DevTools settings? Because now I can easily nudge colors by their red, green, and blue values. So I have this one here. I can click into it, and then as I hit the arrow key up, it's actually increasing the amount of red in this color, which I'm realizing you can't see now because it's a very thin border. So let me just increase this. And so this is like a really cool, if you're trying to get really accurate color changes and you want to just nudge it up by 1 or 2 points, this is really, really kind of a fast way to work. Of course, you can as well click on the color swatch here to bring up your sort of traditional color picker if that's your preferred way of working. You can move, from RGB to HSL and other color modes. And of course, if you haven't seen it before, there is also this eyedropper. So you can actually grab a value directly from the browser as well and apply that. So that is a really handy tip that I use all the time. All right, tip number 4 is quickly showing and hiding elements on the page. Okay, I went years without knowing about this keyboard shortcut. Apparently it's been around forever. It's in like almost all the browsers. It's not super well documented, but I use it all the time. In the elements pane, just have an element selected and hit H on the keyboard. And when you do that, it will actually hide the element, and hitting H again will bring it back. This is really helpful for debugging overlapping divs or just like getting a naughty node out of the way. So now I'm going to go back up to settings for tip number 5, which is customize your shortcuts. So if you don't like the H shortcut, you're not vibing with it, you can actually now customize your keyboard shortcuts in DevTools. This is another feature brought to you by the Edge DevTools team. Really excited about this. I think it's really handy for those designers living in Figma or Photoshop or InDesign or Procreate or whatever. You find you're kind of overloaded with different keeping different shortcuts in mind, you can actually customize those. So there are some default settings. You can also switch those to the VS Code defaults, which is awesome if you live in VS Code like I do. Or you'll notice that there's this little pencil icon, so you can literally just go and change each of these one at a time. One thing I really like about this feature is that it will let you know if your shortcut conflicts with something else. So for example, if I try to change this to something that already exists, it's actually going to give me that red outline to let me know that shortcut's sort of already taken. So that's another really cool feature that I like a lot. So I hope you've learned something useful already to help debug your web design work, but we're actually just a third of the way through. So we're going to keep going with tip number 6, which is use grid overlays to debug CSS Grid layouts. So CSS Grid is weird, it's a little hard, it can be hard to debug, but Edge DevTools has got you. So back in DevTools in the Elements pane, anywhere you see a grid lozenge, you can actually click on that and it will toggle a kind of persistent grid overlay that will show you the track numbers. Now, if I go into the Layout tab here to the right of Styles, I actually get these checkboxes and I can turn on any or all of the grids on the page. You can see I can also customize what the labels show. I personally like to see the authored and computed styles of the columns and rows. I also like to extend the grid lines so I can kind of help line things up. Each of the grids gets assigned a sort of random color, which you can customize with the color picker, and all of the grid items are sort of shaded in with that color, so it really helps you see where the grid is on the page. Now, if there's a Flexbox layout on the page, you're actually going to see similar tooling in this Layout tab as well, though that is still being actively developed, so do stay tuned for that. In the meantime, tip number 7 is to test other device sizes and CPUs with device mode. So just click this icon here to the left of the Elements tab, and you will be in device mode. And this is also how you get out of device mode. You can see in this drop down, there are a bunch of devices that you can simulate. You can even add your own. For dual screen devices like the Galaxy Fold or Surface Duo, we actually have dual screen emulation enabled. So you can see what this will look like for users who have a dual screen device. And in this case, it's even mimicking the hinge, which is pretty cool. And I can interact with this page. I can actually change the orientation of the device and continue to interact with it that way. There's also this drop down which will let you change your simulated network and CPU. So now if I hover over this, I can see that I actually have a 4x CPU slowdown, and some of my tabs like network is sort of giving me the warning sign, letting me know that I have this sort of throttling enabled. So that's pretty cool for kind of, testing performance and also what your site's going to look like on different devices. And while we're here in device mode, I want to talk about tip number 8, which is also in device mode, and that is debugging media queries in device mode. So up here, I've actually changed this back to responsive mode, and up here in this ... menu, first I'm going to turn on rulers. This is actually my preferred way of interacting with rulers, rather than having them on all the time, is just to have them in this sort of device mode setting. But in that same menu, I can also actually access this feature, Show Media Queries. And you see these bars that popped up. Now, these aren't like prefab device sizes. These are actually based on the media queries in your code. So you can see what happens when you hit certain media query breakpoints. You can actually click on these and have the page snap to those sizes. So this is a great feature I feel like not enough people know about for debugging media queries. Now, device mode, it does emulate the size and performance of other devices, but obviously those aren't really like emulating those devices, right? Like we're not running Android in the DevTools. We're not running iOS. That would be cool if we could. But right now, cross-browser testing is kind of complicated, and it's honestly a huge headache sometimes. So I want to show you something that I think will save you a lot of time if you're doing this with your layouts, and that is in the Issues pane. So I'm actually going to get out of device mode here and open up the More Tools menu, which is that, again, the ... in the upper right corner. Now, if you didn't know this, there are actually a bunch of tools in the DevTools that don't open by default, so you should check out this menu. There's a lot in DevTools. But for now, I'm going to just open up the Issues panel. This is a relatively new tool. And so tip number 9 is fix cross-browser compat issues with webhint. So in the Edge DevTools, now this is one of those features that's just an Edge at the moment. The Issues panel here is not only going to show platform warnings, but it's also integrating the open source web auditing tool webhint, which gathers best practices on web code from sources like Axe and MDN. And it will let you know things like what part of your code base is incompatible with certain browsers. And when I drill into this, I can actually see what part of my code may not be supported by certain browsers. I can jump to that in Elements, or I can even go out and look at the MDN documentation on that feature. So this is a big game changer for me. I'm on my Mac. I can see not only Edge issues, but Safari issues, or iOS, or old iOS, or Android, even Internet Explorer issues. So that's really, really handy. And of course, webhint offers a lot of feedback, not just cross-browser compat. You can see there's accessibility, perf, security, lots of good stuff in there. So I definitely recommend checking this out to help you kind of understand what features are or are not supported on different browsers. So tip number 10 is to become a split screen expert. You might have noticed that the Issues tab sort of opened by default in the bottom half of the DevTools. And it's a little confusing because DevTools has a lot going on, but there is this sort of bottom panel in DevTools, and it's actually possible to hide and show it using the escape key. So I know it's a little hard to see here on screen share, but as I toggle it on and off with the escape key, that bottom pane is actually hiding and then re-showing. For years now, you were only able to open some tabs in the top and some tabs in the bottom. And so one feature that the Edge DevTools team brought to Chromium recently was the ability to actually move tabs between the top and bottom panes. So if you wanted to see elements and sources at the same time, you can actually just move things between that sort of bottom closable or dismissible pane and the top sort of main pane. So this is really cool for a couple of reasons. One, it's easy to switch things around. Two, it's easy to see different tools at the same time. So now I'm going to go ahead and open up another tool. And this is going to be tip number 11, observe and change page rendering with the rendering tab. So the rendering tab, I'm going to admit, is a bit of a grab bag, but it has a lot of useful stuff in here. You can see that I've flipped on paint flashing and frame rendering stats. So you can see that as the page is updating, you saw that animation sort of flash green, letting you know that the page had been repainted. The stats here are showing me if I'm dropping frames, GPU memory, things like that. And now what I'm playing with is actually emulating color blindness and other vision deficiencies. So this is really interesting way to get some accessibility insight. Here we see sort of our like red-green color blindness test. So I'm actually going to turn some of these off just for the sake of clarity and showing some other features, but I did want to show that. I think this is another tool that a lot of people don't open, but actually has a lot of really cool stuff in it. So tip number 12 is examine unused CSS with the coverage tab. So again, I'm going to go to more tools and open up coverage. And actually, I'll just keep it down here. This is pretty interesting. So what this does is you basically are going to click this reload button down here to start capturing coverage. And what we see is stats coming in about how much of the CSS and JavaScript has actually been used, which is that blue-green color, versus unused, which is red. Now, red or unused, it doesn't mean that it's never used. It just means it hasn't been used yet. So you see as I'm actually scrolling through the page that red is shrinking because more of that CSS is being applied. And so when I click into these files, what's pretty interesting is that I'm actually going to be able to see along the sides of the file these red and blue bars, so I can understand what has or hasn't been used in this particular run through of the page. Again, this isn't saying that the CSS will never be used, but it has not been accessed in this sort of capture. So I find this super helpful in getting a quick glance of, hey, is there some CSS that's not doing what I think it should be based on this action, or media query that's not fired when I think it should be, or, did I leave a bunch of CSS in my file that never gets accessed? Totally guilty of that. So it's another cool kind of at a glance tool for looking at your CSS. So speaking of at a glance in CSS, we're going to head right into tip number 12, which is surveying your CSS with CSS Overview. So CSS Overview, this is a tab that collects information about sort of various tidbits from your CSS and kind of collects it all together. If you've ever worked from a style guide or had to build a style guide, you can see that this is kind of inspired by that process. So you have, your color swatches, you have, so you can kind of see what themes you're following. You do get some interesting like color contrast information. You can read more about typography. So, you want to maybe make sure you don't have like 20 serif fonts on your website, things like that. Another cool way to use this, honestly, is to open it up on another website that you like. So you can check out their typography choices, check out their color palettes, things like that. I kind of like that. All right, I know I've been super speeding through it, but 15 features in about 20 minutes. It's a race, and we are going to finish it. I think we're going to make it. So I am going to open up one more tab for tip number 14, and that is debugging Z-index issues with 3D view. So this is really cool. Again, this is one of those features that is just in Edge DevTools at the moment. So the 3D view tab allows me to visualize the Z-index in sort of 3D space. And you can see these labels here are actually showing me the authored Z-index value if there is one. And this is really, really, it's just fun. Like, let's be real, it's just fun. But I think it is also pretty interesting to see that Z-index kind of represented in 3D space. You also have the ability to check out the DOM, which, DOM stacking is a little bit different than Z-index, but this is pretty cool as well. You can use these heat maps. You can also apply screen textures here. So again, aside from being super fun to like do a VR 3D walkthrough of your website, I think it's another thing that I use a lot in combination with that H shortcut to debug overlapping divs or sort of wonky Z-indexing. So we've made it all the way to tip 15. Awesome. Drum roll, please. And that one is actually to bring the DevTools features into VS Code. So like I said, I live in VS Code. I know a lot of us doing front-end design do some dance where we have like a 2-monitor setup, or we have VS Code, kind of going back and forth, playing the minimize maximize game, or multiple windows going. And so I did want to mention this Microsoft Edge Tools for VS Code extension. And so this gives you kind of another option for working that I think is really attractive. You can install this directly from the VS Code extension store. And basically, as I'm going to let the GIF to do the talking here, but you can interact with your web app just like you would in the regular Edge browser, but from getting some of these Edge DevTools features actually inside of VS Code. So, you can click on links in your app, you can set breakpoints, but you're kind of in your code base. Rather than doing a lot of switching back and forth, and you still have access to like the hover tools and things like that. So unfortunately, we don't have time to really walk through it in full detail, but again, like, don't take my word for it. I would definitely give it a spin and try it out. It's pretty new, so I think it's an exciting new way to work in the DevTools. So I hope now we've gone through all 15. Phew. Quite the ride. I would love to know what you think. Which of these tips were brand new for you? I'm really curious to know, because I have been using DevTools for years, but there's always something that I learned that I didn't know how to do before. So I want to hear from you. Which of these tips were new for you? Which are, maybe there's some tips that I didn't talk about that you'd like to share in the chat, or you want to let me know about. So I'd love to hear from you. For now, we are going to move into the Q&A portion of the chat. So until then, thanks for watching and happy coding.